Oui, ma question est très simple. On a souvent entendu des gens qui viennent d'Israël, etc., et qui nous disent et qui nous font des reproches à nous, Européens. Mais notre orateur d'aujourd'hui est originaire des États-Unis, je crois. Comment voit-il le problème américain? Parce que finalement, tout ce que Israël a fait jusqu'ici a toujours eu le soutien total des États-Unis. Et non seulement on n'a pas parlé de boycott, évidemment, des Américains, mais il y a un soutien financier énorme qui n'a jamais été coupé. Et je crois que c'est quand même là-dessus qu'Israël se base pour continuer sa politique.
Merci. Une troisième question avant de...
Ok.
Oui, ici. Encore.
Je voulais vous demander, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de la position de quelqu'un comme Miko Peled, qui préconise un seul État démocratique dans lequel tous les citoyens, quelle que soit leur origine ethnique ou leur croyance religieuse, auraient exactement le même droit? Est-ce que vous pensez que la population israélienne serait prête à accepter ce genre de solution?
Merci. To you, Jeff.
Okay. Actually, I just did I'm trying to find it here. I just did a lecture tour on the one-state solution in France. And I don't know if this is, if this is trying to tell me that this is the one. So I had a whole thing out here, but I don't know if this is the right. It doesn't matter. You know, I'm playing with the idea of one state because, you know, ICAD, my organization, is political. We want to end the occupation and see a just peace. So for us to be in a political struggle without anything to advocate for is very difficult. One state or two states or something else. But we have to follow the Palestinians. We're not Palestinians. Certainly I'm not. I'm Israeli. I've lived in Israel. I grew up in the States, but I've lived in Israel for 40 years already. And so we have to follow the lead of our Palestinian partners. We can't advocate without their okay, in a sense. And like I said, they're in between. They haven't really, I think, formulated where they're going. So right now we don't exactly have something to advocate for. So I'm trying to articulate what a one-state solution would look like, as to begin the process, because there isn't much talking about the one-state solution. And I think it would have to be, you know, first of all, it would have to be binational, because there are two national groups there. And in fact, all right, here. In fact, these are, what I'm trying to do first, and I'll do it real quick, is to say, before we get to a solution, what elements have to go into any solution? Because it doesn't, it's a million solutions, but what, and these I think are 7 elements that have to go into any solution that's going to work. And I think we have to start with the idea that this is binational. Miko Peled doesn't do that. And actually a lot of Palestinians today are going from the idea that Zionism is simply colonialism, that it has no legitimacy, there is no such thing as Israeli, and therefore there shouldn't be a binational. We're not going to recognize Israel as a national group. And it's the same as Zionism. Zionism does the same thing. It said there's only one national group in the land of Israel, and that's the Jewish group, and Palestinians aren't a people. They're just Arabs. So we're in that a kind of a dialogue that's very interesting today, But I think we have to accept the fact, sociologically, if not politically, that there are two peoples living in this country, and any solution has to be inclusive of everybody. It can't be exclusive. We have to find a balance between collective rights of self-determination that Palestinians and Israelis claim, and individual rights. So there has to be some mix of democracy and national self-determination. It has to conform to human rights and international law. I won't get into that. You certainly have to resolve the refugee issue based on the right of return, that Palestinians have a right of return. The state has to be economically viable, so you can't have a situation like South Africa where you have political liberation, but economically you've kept the old structures. That shouldn't work. You have to address the security concerns of everybody in the region, and I think the solution has to be regional in scope. And so where that led me, I'll just do this real quick, it's kind of interesting. What does that mean? So what would that mean on the ground? Well, you have two models of societies. Europe is based on the idea of a state, Western Europe, certainly. The idea of a state that rules over citizens. Those are really the only two legitimate categories in Europe. You have a state and citizens. And all the groups in between that we have, religious groups, ethnic groups, national groups like the Roma, for example, even political groups. You know, in the 1960s in the States, the American government came down very hard on the hippies because the hippies were seen as subversive because they were a collective. Any collective is seen as subversive to a state because it competes for the loyalty. The state doesn't know with dual loyalty who you're loyal to. States are very jealous. And therefore, they try to break down society only into citizens. I mean, you certainly see that in France today. That tension is very strong. But that's true in European states. The problem is that states are the way the international system is organized. So you can't get away from it. So when we talk about one state or two states with the Palestinians, we're talking about states because somehow you need even though states are not an appropriate category. You know, there's in the Middle East, if we look at the unit in our part of the Middle East, the historical unit is what used to be called Greater Syria. Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan. This is the unit historically, economically, culturally of our part of the world. Well, it isn't 4 or 5 states. You never had states. You're talking about dozens of political communities, religious communities, national communities, ethnic communities, cultures, peoples. States are not appropriate, and we see it because the whole place is up, and especially the Israel-Palestine conflict. The states that the European colonists put into place are destructive. So why do we need them? Well, we only need them because that's the way the international system is still constructed. But there's another model that comes out of the Middle East, which is actually more of a multicultural model. In the Middle East, you never had states. You had empires, or you had provinces, you had this. But your ethnic, religious, civil status was your religious status. You were either a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. And each of those communities were legitimate and had rights. So what I'm saying, just shortly now, in terms of the model is, I think this might be a new model that we could adapt for a new one-state solution, and that is, take a state, if you need a state, but a weak techno-state. I'm thinking of something like Switzerland, or maybe Belgium. And the Belgians aren't so upset with their situation, actually. Belgium's not working too badly, even though, it's in a state model, it's not too good, but in some ways, Belgium isn't so bad. And at any rate, a weak techno-state in which, taken from the Middle East model, it's actually the communities that states don't like that are the building blocks of the society. So you would have, the different ethnic and national groups would have their own institutions. I'm thinking, for example, in Israel-Palestine, each group would have a national university to continue its culture and its language. Each group would have a national museum. It would have different national institutions and schools, so that while you're participating in a common state, there's an expression for the binationalism of the country. You can't ignore that. And then there would be a citizenship that would vote for the institutions of this state, and maybe the state would become stronger over time, like Jordan has, or maybe not. So if I'm thinking about a model of a one state, I would think of something like this. Something that is a weak state and that has very strong institutions and legitimacy for the national groups living in it, especially Israelis and Palestinians.
Don't forget the question about
Yeah.
mistakes.
So that's sort of a mixture. In terms of just in a word, in terms of the United States, the United States is the big problem. I mean, without the United States, Europe might do more. I think Europe is held back because it doesn't want to get into a fight with the United States. And the United States is not only in this issue, but is the problem that we all have. And here Israel has become, for different reasons, a domestic issue in the United States. When you have, Europe is a foreign issue, and NATO is a foreign issue, China is a foreign issue. Israel is an American issue. As we say, it's as American as apple pie. It was mentioned last week or a couple of weeks ago, Obama gave his State of the Union address, and he talked about Israel. It's an American, and American politicians in Congress believe that they won't be reelected if they're critical of Israel. And you have the Israeli lobby, but it goes beyond the Israeli lobby. You also have the Jewish community, which is very powerful in the Democratic Party, but you have the Christian fundamentalists who are powerful in the Republican Party. So it's both parties. And if you think about it, if anybody here is into advertising or PR, the greatest piece of PR, of public relations, that was ever produced, in my view, is the book Exodus. All of us of a certain age, all of us read Exodus. It was translated into, 30 languages. It was, so we identified with the characters. And all the Jewish characters in the book Exodus have names, and we still remember the names. Ari ben Canaan, and Karen, who's a blonde-haired girl who's raped by the Arabs in the end. And the Arabs don't have names. The Arabs are gangs, and they're all covered. You don't see anything except their eyes, And it really fashioned this idea that Israel belongs to the West. It's even American, because then you had the movie Exodus with Paul Newman. You don't get much more American than Paul Newman. Music by Harry Mancini, sung by Andy Williams, who just died. Remember, this land is mine, God gave this land to me. That was the #1 song. It shows you how good our music was in those days. So it became Israel became America. And so I think the problem there is that it becomes a part of domestic politics, and you're expected to be pro-Israel if you want to be elected. So that it makes it very difficult to deal with Israel in any kind of a critical way. And I think it really, from Israel's point of view, it's not, the president doesn't matter. It's Congress that matters. And as long as Israel has both parties of Congress in its pocket, it's home free. It doesn't care about Europe, doesn't care about the UN, doesn't care about Obama. Israel hates Obama. It doesn't care about Bush, who is super friendly to Israel. It only cares about Congress. And there's no sign of any weakening of support for Israel. And that's the problem we have. So I think we're going to have to start, and hopefully this might happen, bypassing the United States. Brazil is trying to get more involved internationally. China is beginning in certain ways to move out of its shell and get more involved with things. So if we could begin to look at Europe working with Brazil and China and other countries in terms of bypassing the United States, not only in this issue, but in general, but especially on this issue, maybe we could begin to, I think the United States is getting very isolated in the world. You saw it in the UN vote. It was Israel, the United States, and the Czech Republic and Canada. So that I think this is starting to happen, and we should try to encourage that process of isolating the United States on this issue.
Nous allons encore prendre une ou deux
It's getting
questions,
late.
puisque nous avons commencé un peu plus tard, 3 questions. Nous terminerons vers 10h15, d'accord? Puisqu'on a commencé un peu en retard.
The last 3 questions?
Yes.
And I'll be brief, I promise.
Voilà, alors s'il y a 3 questions, n'ayez crainte.
En fait, j'aimerais savoir par rapport aux révoltes arabes, donc notamment en Syrie, et j'aimerais savoir ce que vous pensiez de la situation d'Israël et ce qu'aimerait Israël en fait, le projet israélien dans cette situation au Moyen-Orient.
Merci. Une autre question? Oui, Jean, là au-dessus.
Oui, je voudrais simplement savoir what is your message, concrete and clear, towards us?
Message?
What is your message, clear and concrete, towards us as citizens of Europe and citizens of Luxembourg? What can we do?
The hard question at the end.
Très brièvement, Armand Claes, c'est mon nom. Une question en français, oui. Puisque je pense, pour n'importe quel observateur ou analyste un peu honnête intellectuellement et intègre et lucide, également sur le plan moral, il ne peut pas vraiment y avoir de paix, ni à moyen terme, ni à long terme. Est-ce que, quand même, ça vaut la peine de faire semblant, comme s'il y avait une perspective, ou est-ce qu'il vaudrait mieux mettre fin à l'hypocrisie et ne plus parler de processus de paix et travailler vers une paix qui, de toute façon, excusez-moi, reste complètement illusoire, n'est-ce pas? Mettre fin à cette comédie malsaine. Ça, c'est la question.
Merci. Merci. Jeff? To you.
Wait, what would be better than the peace process? I didn't quite get it.
The hypocrisy of the
You're right, okay.
I can say it in English. So since anyway there can't be peace, wouldn't it be better to stop talking this
Right.
political way of the peace process, which may lead to peace? This
That's right.
very insane comedy
Right.
is playing for. I have watched it myself for more than 40 years. Some in this home too. But would it not be better also for the sake of intellectual honesty and moral integrity?
But to say what? That the conflict is non-solvable?
Let's stop talking about the peace
Right.
And also another stuff that I don't want to.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's- Okay, I'll be very brief. Actually, he gave me 10 minutes. I won't take 10 minutes. Well, I'm not sure exactly, just to go on. I mean, we've always said the peace process is a sham. It's not real. And that's what we have. That's what's very hard. You know, politicians in particular like to talk about both sides because it's easier. You try to be critical of Israel, but in order not to be too critical, you bring in the Palestinians. So both sides should negotiate. Both sides should end the fight. And of course, there isn't both sides. There's only one occupying power, and that's Israel. There's only one country with an army, and that's Israel. There's only one country with international support officially. You know, the United States is officially a strategic ally of the United States by treaty, and it's a part of NATO. It's not a member of NATO, but it's officially a part of NATO. So, and the Palestinians aren't. So, in other words, there's a power differential, first of all, that we don't talk about, and that is that Israel is the strong party, and therefore it can be held accountable for its actions without the Palestinians. And the second thing we don't talk about is that it's not only that Israel is not only the strong party. I lost my train of thought, but you know yeah. What we don't talk about, that's hard to talk about, especially if you're not Jewish, is that Israel is not working in good faith. That's a very hard thing to talk about. But the assumption of any negotiation or any peace process is we might not agree, but we're trying to solve the problem. We're trying to resolve the conflict. And it might be hard, but we're negotiating, we're talking, we're this. No. Israel does not want to resolve the conflict. Israel thinks it can win. And if you can beat the other side, then why would you compromise? So Israel is not negotiating. Israel doesn't want peace with the Palestinians. It wants to control the Palestinians. Israel does not want a two-state solution. It wants the whole thing. And so that's where the peace process is really a shambles, is really a sham, a charade, because there's no process. And governments just can't say that. Even many activists can't say it because they think it's anti-Semitic or it's not fair or this or that. But that's the truth, and that's what makes every peace process not legitimate, not real. And we have to say that. And then I think we have to try to, just to go in a minute, what would be the message to Europe or Luxembourg or whatever, which isn't easy because, again, I don't have a solution to sell right now. We're in between solutions. But I would say two things. One is, just to continue what we were saying, is that there is a roadmap to a just peace, and that is international law and human rights. If we would simply apply the Fourth Geneva Convention, that even Israel is a signatory to the occupied territories, that would end the occupation, because everything Israel's done is illegal by international law that we all subscribe to. So that would be one of my messages, is forget the roadmap, forget the quartet, forget negotiations. Let's say this is an occupation, and Israel has managed all these years to avoid that this is an occupation, because it argues that there is no occupation, Because an occupation is when one sovereign country conquers the territory of another sovereign country. And since there was never a sovereign in Palestine before, Jordan and Egypt were occupying powers, and then you had Britain, then you had the Ottoman Empire, so there is no occupation. Nobody, no country in the world, including the United States, accepts that argument. Nobody. But it's enough to make the argument that you can prevent any kind of legal process from happening. That has to be ended. The international, and as a matter of fact, in 2004, the International Court of Justice in The Hague said that there is an occupation. So okay, if there is an occupation, and actually if last November the UN recognized Palestinian sovereignty in those territories, then let's implement the Fourth Geneva Convention, and you'll end the occupation. The settlements are gone without Israel. Forget Israel. Israel has no right to, you don't have to negotiate with Israel. And that's the problem, because what Israel did in Oslo, and this is part of the problem. Rabin understood this. Rabin, when Oslo was cooking, in 1993, Rabin went to Clinton. And he said to Clinton, if international law is a part of negotiations, we lose. We lose. You don't have to negotiate. It's a checklist. Settlement's gone. The military. And so Rabin said, I will not enter into negotiations with Arafat unless you, the Americans, take international law out of the negotiating process. And what the Americans did, until 1993, they recognized that these were occupied territories, the settlements were illegal. Jimmy Carter went to Jerusalem when he was president and refused to go to East Jerusalem. What Clinton did is he adopted the idea of constructive ambiguity. How's that for an Orwellian term? And that meant that the United States reclassified the occupied territories from being occupied to being disputed territories, which until today is the American position. These are disputed territories. That took international law out, and then the Palestinians lose. Because if they have to negotiate by power every road, every rock, every settlement, they lose. They have no leverage. And so that would be one of my messages. Simply apply the law that exists, that we've all signed on to, and you'll end the occupation. And the second thing, just in a word, is that this conflict is a global conflict. It impacts Europe. It impacts Luxembourg. If this was just a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, who cares? I mean, there's thousands of conflicts all over, and some conflicts are worse, like the Congo. Who would care? But this disrupts the entire international system. It's alienating the entire Muslim world from the West. The occupation is seen as a Western occupation. It affects, there's 5 wars being fought in the region. People are concerned about terrorism and security and Islamic radical Islam. You've got oil issues, geopolitical. I mean, it's a huge thing, this conflict. It isn't simply Israel-Palestine. And therefore, when I've heard Europeans say, governments say, well, Israel and Palestine have to work it out themselves, which is the most cynical thing you can say, because how can the Palestinians work it out with the Israelis? It's ridiculous. But why? This is a European issue as much as it is an Israeli-Palestinian issue. It impacts on Europe no less than it impacts in some ways on Israelis and Palestinians. So Europe has every right in the world to become an active participant in this process. So those would be my 2 messages.
And
apply international law.
What about the civil society?
And of course, I just go back in a minute to civil society. We have to push the governments. That's the thing. I mean, in other words, my message is more towards us, and that's why your committee here is so important and so on, because governments will only move if they're pushed by the people. So we have to have analyses. We have to have BDS campaigns that are important. We have to change public opinion. We have to motivate the churches. I mean, churches are starting to speak out in many places, including the United States, where they have a lot of influence. We have to, labor union, trade unions. In other words, mobilize every bit of civil society that we can, and eventually we'll begin to move governments. Because like I said, we're in a bad marriage, and we need the damn governments, even though they're not really our friends, and they're not on our side. And finally, my last word, I promise, is about the Arab Spring and Syria and so on. And I think that I think there's, from our selfish point of view in Israel-Palestine, there's an opportunity here. Because as I've been developing the idea of the one-state solution, I say that it has to be regional. It has to be regional. Israel-Palestine is too small a unit to solve all the problems. The problems that we have are regional. Our water comes from Syria and Lebanon. We don't have water. There's no water in Palestine. The issue of refugees is regional. If you're talking about security, economic development, these are regional issues. You can't isolate Israel-Palestine from the rest of the region. And so I just see, let's end this on a dream. Right now it's a vision, but you need vision before you get to specific plans. I see 3 stages to what I see as a real comprehensive peace in the whole Middle East, not just in Israel-Palestine, or our region at least. And that is the binational state is the first stage. That's our little piece of it. But then to move into what I call a Middle Eastern economic confederation, something like the European common market was 30 years ago. Not a union, I mean, that's too much for Europe even, but a common market in which people can live and work like the Schengen throughout the region, so that you disconnect citizenship from territory. Israeli settlers can continue to live in the settlements, but they're living as Israeli citizens in Palestine, let's say. Refugees can come back to Haifa from Lebanon, but they come back as Palestinian citizens. So you're protecting the integrity of the different member states, but you're allowing people to live and work wherever they want to. I think that's where Europe can play a role. Maybe that's my third message. The United States has no conception of confederations or larger units like that. This is where Europe, with all the problems of the EU that I'm aware of, nevertheless, you have a model of big countries with little countries, powerful economies like Israel with weaker economies like Jordan. There are models that I think could be applied. And then the third stage, which is really the dreamy part, would be what I call a Middle Eastern confederation of peoples and cultures. Because this is the problem. The states don't fit. The states are what are creating the conflicts. And we have to free the peoples in order that they begin to express themselves, and they don't have to be they're only in conflict because of these state systems that don't work. And so I would tend to see something like a constituent assemblies in our part of the Middle East. It could be a people's cultural assembly. So if you're Druze or Bedouin or Circassian, or you belong to a lot of the cultural communities in our part of the world, there could be assemblies where those peoples would meet and talk and work out their issues and this and that in a constructive way, because there's no competition here. You could have a national assembly for people that identify as nationals, Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, maybe Syrians, you could have an assembly of religions. Well, you've got, besides Muslims, Christians, and Jews, you have 100 different kinds of Christians, you got 50 different kinds of Jews, you have 40 different kinds of Muslims, all kinds of, well, let them all come to expression. And again, you could have an assembly of religions, and then for people like most of us that don't want to belong to any of those things, I certainly don't, a free assembly of just people that just want to be people. And you could have an assembly just of people. And in a sense, this is really much more reflective of the actual reality of the Middle East than some state is. And then you could have, again, a weak technocratic executive, something like the European Commission, very weak but kind of an administrative unit, but the strong, and then you could have a confederational assembly. Right now this is really, I know, fantasy and so on, but I think that this reflects much more the sociological reality of the Middle East. Now the question is, how do you translate this into something that would work? Rather than taking something that doesn't work, like a state system, and trying to impose it on the region. So that and the Arab Spring is in a way an opportunity, because I think it's partly it's a reaction to these state systems that are, who's Syria, who's Lebanon? I mean, Lebanon was created by the French. I mean, all these places are artificial, and they set one group against the other, and then they're autocratic. So if you could get into a vision in which civil society, I would love to be able to talk to my Syrian counterparts, people in Syria that are committed to human rights and progressive things. They're there, but they can't talk to me because I'm the enemy, and they're and we have all these. So we should use all this, the Arab Spring, the Arab uprising, as an opportunity to break all these barriers that the states have set up, one against the other, and begin to talk to each other horizontally about how do we reconstitute something in the Middle East that really is meaningful and inclusive for all of us. So the Arab Spring has a lot of potential, but without a vision, it becomes, it can't go anywhere. What are you going to do? Just take over another Egypt and reconstitute another Syria? And you're not dealing with the problems here. You're changing one regime for another regime. So that I think, the idea of having a new vision, throwing that in, even if it's dreamy, is not a bad thing to do.
Merci.
So thank you.
Merci, Jeff. Bon. Avant que vous ne quittiez, je crois que Jeff a quelque chose à nous dire et une demande à nous faire. Je crois qu'il va vous l'expliquer en 2 mots et je compléterai après.
That's dangerous.
No, in 3 words. Il a une demande à nous faire.
No, we simply, as I mentioned, we need financial support from the people in order to continue our work. And so I think there's some bowls out here or something. I usually like to do it in church, where the bowl goes around, but they said in Luxembourg people don't like to do church things, so we'll do it this way. But if you could contribute anything that you can to our work, that would be, it's very important. We really don't have major sources of support as a radical, more political organization. So we need your help. And if you'd like to write a check for more, or do a credit card, I don't know, Michel, you have a way to do.
Non, j'insiste, pourquoi? Parce que c'est une organisation israélienne. Très peu de support, évidemment, de l'intérieur. Il y avait, pour eux, comme pour d'autres organisations que nous connaissons bien, Alternative Information Center, nous connaissons très bien, Warszawski et d'autres, les supports viennent principalement, sinon exclusivement, de l'Europe. aussi des États-Unis. Mais la crise étant là, les subsides, les soutiens à ce genre d'organisme est en train de diminuer de manière dramatique, au point que, par exemple, l'Alternative Information Center est en train d'envisager de fermer son unité à Jérusalem. Hein, il y a l'autre à Bethléem. C'est pour vous dire que ce n'est pas seulement une aide financière comme ça, c'est soutenir l'alternative à l'intérieur d'Israël et aussi à l'intérieur de la Palestine. Si vous pouvez contribuer ce soir par un don dans la boîte qui est là, c'est très bien. Si vous ne le pouvez pas, vous avez toujours la possibilité de faire un don via le compte bancaire du CPJPO avec la mention soutien à ICAD, ICAHD, hein, International Committee, Israeli Committee Against House Demolition. Voilà. Après ceci, nous avons encore la possibilité de parler avec Jeff, de boire un verre à la salle à côté, mais je crois que je peux... Pardon? Et bien sûr, il y a son livre, un de ses récents livres en anglais, qui vient d'être traduit aussi en allemand et qui sera traduit aussi en français, mais il est au stand, ainsi que le livre de M. Essel. Je crois qu'on peut encore l'applaudir et le soutenir pour tous les Israéliens qui se battent.
I just want to say thank you very much for coming and thank the translators for a good job. Okay,
Merci,
thank
merci,
you.
merci. Bonne fin de soirée à vous et à bientôt.